Hey, what up y'all? We're back on the roof with the second video in the Fix Your Mix series. And today we have a submission from Lucid Bloom and his track Astral, so let's take a listen. That's nice, what a cool Psy Trance track, but I can already hear some minor issues with it, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna start by working on the kick, then bass, then main melodic element, then drums. Then from there the elements in the break, including the vocal and sound effects. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so here's how the kick sounds. So as you can see right here, it's missing a lot of highs, and you can also see it clearly in the waveform. If we zoom in on the kick, you can see how there's a fade in on this initial part of the attack on those high frequencies. And that's not necessarily an issue, there's nothing wrong with having darker kicks. But since I know he wants to achieve a similar sound to Vini Vici and all of that contemporary Psy Trance, then it's an issue because those newer kicks are much brighter. But the main problem that we have with this kick is the pitch curve. It just sounds too soft, and once again, I feel like this kick would be pretty good if he was trying to go for that early 2000s Psy Trance, you know, because that's how those kicks used to sound. But since I know he's trying to go for that modern Psy Trance, then that softer pitch curve is an issue. So therefore, I went ahead and made a new kick from scratch. So first I set the length to 1/8, which is relative to the BPM. In this case, it's around 218 milliseconds. So first off, we have this point right here, all the way to the top. That's to ensure that we're getting all of those high frequencies, and that's the thing that was missing in the original kick. So this point is all the way to the top. Then the next point would be this one, which is set to our root key, the key of the track, which is F sharp. So I placed it at F sharp 1. Then I went ahead and placed this point right here, which is the point of transition between our click and our punch. So I set it at the 2048th mark at G6, which is super early but also super high. So we're gonna get those high frequencies, but not a lot of them, just enough in order for them to be heard, but not to overpower and sound harsh. And of course you can experiment, move it a little bit here, a little bit there. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it matters on your taste, you know, what you're trying to achieve. Then I set the next point, which controls the final part of the pitch down, and I set it at the 164th mark at A sharp 2, which is set pretty late, which creates that somewhat hard body that those kicks usually have. Now, don't worry, I'll talk about this point later when we get to the bass. So don't worry, I haven't forgot about this point. And before we move on to the amp curve, I just want to mention that I have the drive set to 60%. Now, it's not necessary, it's just to roughen up the sound a little bit. It's very subtle, and just keep in mind that if you do that and apply distortion and whatnot, that it's gonna affect the amp curve. So it's important to note. But yeah, now in order to talk about our amp curve, we need to talk about our targets over here. The targets right here in my plugin. By the way, it's a free plugin. You can go and get it right now and follow along. The link would be in the description. So if you wanna get it, you can do so. It's absolutely free. So yeah, our target's gonna be for the first band minus 2 dB, and then the second band also at minus 2 dB. Then the third band can sit between 2 to 4 dB over the 0 line, and then the final two bands are going to hit plus 6 dB. So it's important to define the targets before we start messing with the amp curve, because the amplitude curve is going to directly impact on whether we hit those targets or not. As you can see, I have the first point set to 45%. Now, if this was higher, as you can see, it's boosting the high frequencies. So if we go right here to the plugin, it's going to show that we're way over that 6 dB target that we set for ourselves. Yeah, so as you can see, we're hitting 11 to 12 dB right here. Yeah, so that's how you're gonna do it. You're gonna go back and forth. You're gonna set it to a specific value, and then you're gonna go over here and see if you reached that target. And then you're going to go and make another change and so on until you hit the specific target for that band. Now, just an overall note about this, the amplitude curve is not going to be 100% accurate in order to be specific and lower specific frequency ranges. So if you're getting frustrated because you're not getting the result that you want, you're not hitting the specific target that you set over here, don't stress about it. Like, you just need to get it close enough. And then later on, as you can see right here, I have an EQ which will help us to make the final adjustments in order to hit those targets more accurately. So yeah, don't stress about the amp curve too much. Now, the second point we have at the 1/2048 mark, set it to 100% volume. Then the third one is going to be at the 1/512 mark, set to 30%. And then the fourth one is also set to 30% volume, which is at the 1/64th mark. And the last point at 0% at the end of our 1/8 length. Now you can see that I have curved the lines between specific points. That's in order to hit those targets a little bit better over here, but also to achieve a smooth shape. So if we look at our kicks waveform, we can see how we're achieving that smooth waveform, that beautiful Psy Trance shape. And of course, that the most important thing is how it sounds. I get a lot of messages from people about, oh, you're concentrating too much on the visual side or whatnot, which is not true, by the way. Like, I've never claimed that the visual side is better or more important than listening to the actual sound with our ears. So what those people don't understand, that trusting only our ears is very limiting and will never get us to 100% all of the time. So it means that we're not going to get consistent results. And that's just a fact. You know, you can argue with me for eternity, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the fact that our ears are flawed and they will never be 100% accurate all of the time, or even most of the time. So that's why it's important to help our ears with visual tools and indicators like such. So yes, the first thing that matters is how the sound actually sounds. Then if it sounds good, then great. Then the second indicator will be to look at the waveform like this and making sure that the shape is good and there's no problems or anything like that. Like, for example, if we look at the original kick, we can see how there's this unbalance going on a little bit here in the volume, where some of those cycles are lower than some of the other cycles. And, you know, this can happen for a variety of reasons. And honestly, this is not a big issue right here with the original kick, but sometimes I will see kicks like this. You know, I just went ahead and exaggerated this. I just boosted the volume right here. And you would be surprised how many samples like this I've seen from big companies and big artists. So if you see something like this, that is a tell that something is not quite right here and there's an issue with the kick. And then the third and last indicator is to actually look at the frequency spectrum of the kick. But before we do that, just to prove a point, I'm going to go and play the kick for you first, and then we're going to talk about what we see. So this is how our kick currently sounds like. So now, after listening to our kick, some of you might say, well, we listened to the kick and it sounded good. I don't hear any problems. We looked at the waveform and it seems to be very smooth and solid. There's no issues right here, that nothing really is sticking out. But if we were to look at the spectrum of the kick, we would see that we have a bump right here, which is an indicator that we have a buildup of frequencies right here. So all we need to do is just tackle it with an EQ. And as you can see right here, I already did. I lowered this frequency range by 8 dB. And if we were to play it and look at it at the same time, we can see that we're smoothing out the spectrum, the curve. And then I also boosted this frequency area right here, but that's only to hit our targets over here. So if we were to play the kick now, we can see that we're hitting all of our targets. And as I said in the previous video, it doesn't have to be precise. So if it's hitting at minus 2.18 dB, you know, that doesn't matter. 0 dB here, 0.2 dB there, like, it's not crucial. So now that we're hitting all of our targets, we can see how there's no problems with the spectral curve of our kick. And we're getting that straight line that I was talking about in the previous video. And by the way, if you want to get the full learning experience, you should watch these videos in order. So if you haven't watched that previous video video, the first video in the Fix Your Mix series, I would encourage you to go and watch that, because if something is unclear to you and you're like, why is he glossing over this thing or whatever, it's probably because I already talked about it in the previous video. But yeah, so back to our point about the 3 indicators. First, how it sounds. That's the thing that matters the most, you know, like if the shape is a little bit weird or the spectrum is a little bit weird, at the end of the day, the thing that matters the most is how it sounds. If it sounds good, it sounds good, you know what I mean? But those are good indicators to have in order to help our ears and identify potential problems. So yeah, trusting only your ears is not going to give you consistent results, but doing this would guarantee consistent results every single time. I promise you, on my mama, you know, like what do the kids say these days? On God or whatever. But yeah, we're done with our kick, and this is how it sounds like without the EQ and then with the EQ. And one more thing, usually in these types of kicks, they usually layer it with like a hi-hat or a cymbal or a noise layer of some sorts in order to mask the click that we're getting, because usually this pure sine wave click is a little bit plasticky sounding. So usually that's what they do in order to mask. We also did that in the previous video, if you remember. So you can add some sort of a hi-hat, but whatever layer you're going to add, just make sure that the length is set correctly, because we just want a little bit, just a tiny hit on the transient, and also make sure that it's not too loud so it doesn't mess with the balance that we already achieved in the plugin over here. You know, when we hit those targets, we don't want to mess with this balance. So yeah, for this kick, I chose this hat layer right here, and I set it to -11 dB, and this is how it sounds by itself, and this is how it sounds with the kick. So as you can see with this additional layer, we're adding a little bit of frequencies over here at the high frequencies. So just to offset that a little bit, I'm going to lower this first point in the amp curve. I'm going to lower it to like 40% volume. And let's see if we hit the target better over here. Yeah, so as you can see, we made it better and we kept the balance. Okay, so now I'm going to render this kick into audio and we can compare our 2 kicks. So here's the original one. And here's the kick that we just created. Okay, so here's how the bass sounds. Yeah, so I would say this is a very solid attempt in making this type of bass, but as you can see in here, it's a bit of a mess, and that's because he's making a very common mistake, something that I see even big artists make, and the mistake is just overcomplicating this very basic sound, and it's something that I was doing too for years. I mean, it took me literally 9 years to figure out and realize that I was making this mistake and that I was overcomplicating this sound, and I think it stems from our natural tendency to overcomplicate basic sounds, because we tend to believe that basic is bad and that complex equals better, which is totally not true, by the way. Just because a sound is basic doesn't mean it's not good. But I feel like it also stems from this insecurity that we have as producers. It almost feels like cheating, because if we made something and it took only like 1 or 2 moves, it feels like we didn't do enough, like it's not good. So in order to justify it to ourselves and also maybe to justify it to other people, we tend to do way more than what the actual sound needs. So I get where that's coming from, and you can clearly see it here. He had the sub separated, so this is the sub, and then he has like this main top layer, and then these 2 other top layers in order to accentuate the attack. One of them also has like a flanger or a phaser, and I get the logic behind that. I'm assuming that he didn't want the sub to interfere with the kick, but as I said in the previous video, that's actually not a problem. You don't have to totally separate the kick and the sub. They can play together even when you have a plucky bass like this. So there's actually no reason to not have the sub play over here and also to separate the sub from the top frequencies, because by doing that, you're not only making yourself work harder, but you're also also potentially creating problems. And that's really the thing with all of this, because if it was only a matter of people doing stuff their way, then I wouldn't mind that at all. But the problem with doing so is that every step you take in your detour, you're actually increasing the chance of potential problems that could arise from that. So for example, in this instance, when you separate the frequencies like that, you have to keep in mind where you put the crossovers at and make sure that you do it in a clean way so that you're not removing any important information from the sound. But not only that, you also have to be aware of phasing issues. So you would want to use linear phase modes in order to not affect the phase, and so on and so on. So I'm not saying there's no room for complexity or that you shouldn't experiment and try stuff out. If anything, I want you to experiment. I want you to try stuff. I want you to fail because that's how you learn. But I also want you to keep in mind, with every move you do, there's also a potential for harm. So just always keep that in mind, because sometimes it's like that saying, you take one step forward and two steps backwards. So next time you want to put like 10 OTTs on a sound or whatever, just ask yourself, like, do I really need 10 OTTs in order to achieve that goal of mine? Or can I achieve it with one OTT? You know what I mean? So yeah, that's just something to think about. So yeah, like all of the work that he did here is actually not necessary. And I will show you now how to make a Psy Trance bass from scratch, because there's nothing for me to do with this. So I'm just going to mute all of these layers. Okay, so now we're going to open Serum 2 and we're going to go to oscillator A and we're going to choose a regular saw wave. Then we're going to lower the random phase all the way down to 0. What that's going to do is it's going to make it that every time we trigger a note, every time that the bass plays a note, it starts from the same phase position. And that's important, especially for plucky basses, because we want the transient to stay stable, and by making it start from the same position, we're achieving exactly that. Now, in order to turn it into a plucky sound, we're going to do that by enabling the filter, and we're going to use the MG low 12. We're going to set the cutoff to 200 Hertz, and we're going to bring the resonance all the way down. As you can see, it just eliminates that peak because we don't want to create a boost over here. So this is going to make sure that our sound stays clean and balanced. And in order to actually turn it into a pluck, because currently what we have is just a filtered saw wave, we're going to modulate the filter, the cutoff, with LFO1. We're going to set it to envelope mode. I have the rate set to 1/16th. And we're going to create a shape like so. So it's a curved ramp down. And we're going to drag and drop it into the cutoff. So what that's going to do is make it so that every time a note is being triggered, it's going to start with the cutoff open all the way up. So it's not filtering anything. And gradually, over the course of 1/16th, filter all of those frequencies. And it's going to result in something that sounds like this. So that's it. Now we have a plucky bass. So that's really the core of the Psy Trance bass sound. And what we're going to do now is just add a little bit more definition to it, but we're going to do it in a subtle way. So we're not going to change the sound in a drastic way. We're just going to add a little bit more definition to it. So we're just going to sculpt it a little bit and add some more finer details. Now, the first thing that I want to do is accentuate the transient a little bit more in order to make it a little bit more plucky, add a little bit of attack to it. So the way we're going to achieve that is by going to LFO2, we're going to use it in envelope mode, and we're going to set the rate to fast, so all the way up, and we're going to set a shape like so a curved ramp down, and we're going to apply it to the main tuning over here. It's going to be unipolar, and I have it set to 60 semitones, so 60 ST, that's what we're going to enter over here, and that's going to give us 47%. So essentially what we're doing is we're making it so that our bass starts from 60 semitones up and pitching down to the normal pitch at a really high rate. And that's going to help us create a pluckier transient. And it's basically the same thing that we're doing with the kick. As you can see, we're starting from way up and pitching all the way down. So that fast pitch down creates those initial transients. And this is how it sounds with and without it. You see how we added a little bit more click to the sound? And now in order to give it a little bit more definition, what we're going to do is apply the same LFO into the cutoff over here. And I have it set to 70%. So basically what it does, it is creating this shape on top of the shape that we already created with LFO1, sustaining the cutoff a little bit longer at the high frequencies. So it delays the filtration by a little bit, which allows the higher frequencies to be heard a little bit more. And honestly, we could have achieved the same shape shape within filter 1, but the reason why I like to split it into 2 LFOs is because it gives you more control over the details. Even though you can do this, I'm pretty sure, and do something like this essentially, which is the same thing as what we're doing now. But yeah, it really doesn't matter how you do it. So here's how it sounds with and without. So yeah, as you can hear, it's very subtle, but it does make a difference. So now I just want to show you in the waveform the difference between that LFO2 that we've added and between not having it on. So as you can see, the pitch modulation added a little bit over here, and without it, you can see that there's nothing here. Also, the reason why you're not seeing anything here is because the pitch modulation also shifted the waveform's phase. So if I were to move this over here, now they're aligned in phase, so they're starting from the same phase position, but this version has a little transient at the beginning and this one does not. So that's essentially what we're doing to the sound. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to make the sound a bit more pluckier, because currently if we were to look at the waveform of our sound, we can see how it's very blocky. It almost stays at the same volume throughout its entire duration. It dips a little bit, as you can see. This cycle over here is a bit quieter than the first cycle, but that's because of the filtration, the way that the filter is removing some of those frequencies as it reaches the 1/16th point. But what I want to do is to achieve something like this, where we get a little bit more of a volume decay towards the end of the sound, which is going to help define each bass hit and separate the 3 hits, and will help us get a little bit more movement out of our bassline patterns. So to do that, we're going to add another LFO, so LFO3, we're going to set it to envelope mode, we're going to set it to a linear ramp up, and the rate is going to be set to 1/16th. And then we're going to drag and drop it into the level of oscillator A, and as you can see, I have it set to -15%. So what that's going to do is every time a note is being triggered, it's going to lower its volume in a linear way as the note progresses. But after I did that, I found that it wasn't enough, so I added another LFO with this shape right here, another linear ramp down, but the ramp down starts a little bit later. The LFO is also set to envelope mode with 1/16th rate, and I dragged it as well into the level of oscillator A, and I have it set to -25%. So the combination of those two LFOs is going to help us get that volume dip as the bass note is playing. So this is how it sounds with and without it. And you'll also be able to see it clearly in the waveform right here. So the shape is very blocky. We're not getting any separation between each bass note. And now I'm going to enable LFO 3 and 4, and this is how it's going to look now. So as you can see, we're getting a decay, which helps us define each bass note. And of course, you can feel free to experiment with whatever values you want, but I would just warn you to not go overboard, because then what you're going to do is you're going to eat up all of the bass. So I would say experiment, but also be careful to not go overboard with it. As I said, these are just minor details that we're adding, not big changes. Now, before we move on to the last part of this sound, I forgot to actually disable this EQ that I have on, and it's actually a huge part of the sound and making it sound the way it does. Because without it, a normal saw wave at this octave is just going to sound really nasally, so we're going to have to scoop up those frequencies at the 3K hertz range, as we did right here. As you can see, I lowered it by 8 dB, which is a lot, that's not a small move, but it's a necessary one. It's really important, because listen to how it sounds without the EQ. Now, it's not that those frequencies are not important to the sound, and in any other sound, they would have sounded great. If I wanted to make like a bass house womp type of sound, then I would want to actually accentuate those frequencies, because they contribute to the nasally sound of the sound that I'm trying to achieve. So even though this might seem like an extreme move, it's actually necessary for this sound. And the last thing that we're gonna do is talk about the phase position. But so far what we did is just make it so it starts from the same position, but we haven't defined the starting position. And this is important, especially for plucky basses, because the transient is so important for these types of sounds. And out of 360 degrees that we have right here, there's only one spot that actually works. And that spot is going to change based on the note that the bass is playing. So each bass note has a different spot. And this LFO right here, which we've applied to the main tuning, so because it's modulating the pitch, it also messes with the phase of it and the starting position. As you'll see, if I change this to something like this, we'll get a different phase cycle right here. So what you should look for is this position right here. You can see how we're getting a little bit of a transient at the beginning, and then the cycle starts from the very bottom, like so. This is what you're looking for. So if you have it set a little bit different, you know, in your version in Serum 2, don't worry about it. Just look for this phase shape, exactly how it looks like this. So yeah, it's really important to nail that starting phase position. And that's it. That's the sound. You see how easy it is? Like, you don't need to overcomplicate anything. You know, before I used to do stuff like adding bit crushers, choosing different wavetables, adding a bunch of oscillators. Like, you don't need to do all that because the basic sound is already great. There's no reason to mess with it anymore. But with that being said, A, you should feel free to experiment and see what works for you. But B, it doesn't mean that you can't layer it with other sounds, but whatever sound you're choosing to layer with this sound, you need to make sure that you're not taking away anything from this sound and not affecting it in a negative way, so that the other layer respects this layer, because this is the main layer. Because this is it. This is the basic sound. Just make sure you're not doing anything too extra. And by the way, I forgot to mention, if you don't want to guess if you got all of the settings and values right, and if you don't want to deal with any of it, I've created a preset pack which you can get for free with all of the 14 different bass notes. So every preset is the same sound but with different values for each bass note. So F, F sharp, G, G sharp, etc. So if you want to get it, there's going to be a link in the description. You can get it for absolutely free. And I did all of the work for you already, including adding stuff like this punch macro. So what this does, it controls LFO 3 and 4, which you can dial in the specific punch you want. So if you don't want your sub to be as punchy as I have it here in the default position, you can either drag it all the way up, which is going to make it look like this, as you can see, very blocky, or you can dial in your specific punch and have a little bit of decay, so you have that extra control for it. Okay, so before we're gonna go and balance the bass sound, I'm just gonna add some stereo information to the bass, exactly like how I showed in the previous video, but I'm gonna make two changes. As you can see here, besides cutting the fundamental, I'm also cutting the highs, and that's because this bass sound has high frequencies and also it's a plucky bass, so I don't want the high frequencies of the sound to interfere with the mono high frequencies. So I'm cutting everything above 2500, as you can see. And the second thing is I'm setting it a bit higher than what we did in the previous video. I'm setting it to -6 dB, and that's because usually in Psy Trance, the kick and the bass for the most part are the only elements that are playing in the drop, so there's no other elements that can provide that stereo width in those frequencies. Okay, so now I'm gonna play it with and without, and with the EQ and without the EQ, and you will hear how it all sounds. So yeah, as you can hear, it adds that necessary stereo width to the sound. So yeah, now we're gonna tackle the first three harmonics of the sound and make sure that our bass is balanced. By using the same setup as we used in the previous video, we have two EQs and we also have MV meter 2 over here. But before we do that, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into the MIDI and I'm gonna delete these two notes and I'm gonna press this button which will expand the note all the way to the end over here. So essentially we're just gonna work with one bass note instead of working with the three bass notes that are playing very fast, because it can confuse the VU meter over here. So this way we're making sure that we're getting the most accurate readings. And by the way, this whole balance method works best with bass sounds that are playing straight bass notes, so stuff like what we had in the previous video, but it doesn't mean you can't use it with plucky basses like this that play fast notes. It just means that it gets a bit trickier to measure and to balance correctly. And also, you know, there's certain bass sounds that are just impossible for us to balance. So if you're working with something like acoustic jazz bass guitars and stuff like that, parts that play various notes really fast in a complex way with a lot of glide and slide in between notes, so obviously that's going to be impossible for you to balance. So in that case, you just want to make sure that the general area in the 150 Hertz range and below is more or less balanced, instead of trying to EQ the individual frequencies. But yeah, in this case I'm going to show you how it works with a Psy Trance bass. But as I said, it's going to be a bit trickier because it's a bass pluck, which means that the volume is decaying as the bass note plays. And also, since we're using a filter to filter out the frequencies as the bass is playing, what it also means is that the filter is going to dig into those frequencies as it goes down. If you remember, we had it set to 200 Hertz, and since we're using the MG Low 12, you can see how it digs into the frequencies below 200 Hertz. So it's actually affecting stuff over here, the 100, 150 Hertz. So we're also dealing with that. But as I said, it's not impossible. It just means we have to pay attention to that. So yeah, first we're going to measure the fundamental. And it gives us a reading of minus 10.3 dB. So in order to make it easier for us, I'm going to boost this gain knob by 10.3 dB. And now, if I measure the fundamental, it's going to say 0. Yeah, so as you can see, it shows us 0 now, which will make it easier for us to measure the other two frequencies. So now let's see the second harmonic. And we can see that the second harmonic is sitting in minus 4.9 dB. And according to my chart, it's supposed to sit at minus 2.25 dB. So it means we need to go over here into our first EQ and boost this by 2.85 dB. And now if we measure this, it shows us that it's sitting correctly at minus 2.2 dB. And of course, it doesn't have to be accurate. So 0.1 dB here, 0.2 dB there, like it doesn't really matter. So it's about the general balance. And now we're going to measure the third harmonic. And it sits at minus 8.9 dB. And according to my chart, it's supposed to sit at minus 6.75 dB. So it means that we need to boost this one by 2.25 dB. And now if we measure, we can see that we're hitting our target. And that's it. Now our baseline is balanced. So let's see with and without the EQ. Okay, so now before we level the bass, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna duplicate this channel and disable it, and then I'm gonna render this one note into audio. So by working with audio, we're just making sure that everything is okay and we're not gonna get any weird glitches that sometimes we might get with MIDI instruments. In order to avoid audio clicks and pops, I'm just gonna do this towards the end of the clip. So we're fading out the 1/256. Make sure that our transient is not faded out. And I'm just going to duplicate this across. Okay, so now that we have that, we can balance our bass. And if you remember in the previous video, it doesn't matter what bass sound you have, every bass sound should sit over here in this band at minus 4 dB. And by the way, when this video comes out, there's also going to be a Mac version for this plugin. So if you're a Mac user, you can get it right now for absolutely free. Just click the link in the description and you can go to the website and download it for free. So yes, there is a Mac version right now live on the website. And thank you to the people who volunteered to help me test the Mac version since I don't have a Mac computer. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. And real quick, also, by the way, I'm still working on the video for this plugin where I'm going to go into all of the details and the nitty-gritty of stuff. The reason why it's going to take a while to make that video is because I'm not only making it about the plugin, I'm also making it about the system and the method behind it. So I'm trying to really answer every question in that video, so that's why it's gonna take a while to do. So I appreciate your patience, and yeah, let's level this bass. So as you can see, currently it sits at minus 2.93 dB. So all we need to do is compensate over here. So as you can see right here, and now if I play it, you can see it's sitting perfectly at minus 4 dB. And the last thing that is left for us to do with this bass is to sidechain it to the kick. So usually what I will do is use a regular sidechain like so, but as you will see in here, this is sidechaining way too much. So as you can hear, it works great with the kick, but the sidechain is getting rid of this bass note right here, which is not what we want. So what we want to happen is for the low frequencies of that bass note to be sidechained like so it doesn't interfere with the kick, but we want a different type of sidechain shape for the higher frequencies so we can hear that bass note transient clearly. And in order to do that, we need to use multiband sidechaining. So I went ahead and created this. So as you can see, we're separating the bass sound into two frequency parts. the lows, and the highs. And we're applying different shapes to each frequency range, as you can see right here. So this is the lows, we have a more aggressive sidechain, and this is the highs where we have a shape that is less aggressive, that lets this bass note right here to be heard a bit better. And usually the common problem that you're gonna get from using any type of multiband plugin is phase issues because of the split of the frequencies. So that's something to always keep in mind. But what I noticed about this plugin is that if we use the 6 dB octave slope instead of the 12 or 24 dB, we actually don't get any phase issues at all. But the problem with using a 6 dB octave slope, it means that the slope is not steep enough in order to create a clear separation between the two frequency areas. So in order to compensate for that, we need to set the border, the crossover, a little bit higher. So as you can see, I have it set to 600 Hertz. Usually I would set it lower to around 200 Hertz, maybe 300 Hertz. But since you can also see here how the slope is gradually separating the two, this line right here, that's why we need to set it a little bit higher up the frequency spectrum. So this is how it looks and sounds. So as you can see, this multiband sidechain is letting a little bit of the transient out over here so we can hear it better. And yeah, this is it. We're done with our bass. We're done with our kick as well. So let's do a little comparison between the two. And one more thing, I almost forgot about this, but let's talk about this point right here in kick 2. So the reason why I use this point is to align the kick and bass in phase. Now, since we have a plucky bass, we can't mess with the phase starting position of the bass. If you remember, there's only one specific spot that works for that bass transient. So if we change it to something else, in order to align it to our kick, we're gonna lose that transient, that click of the bass. And the same thing will happen if we mess with the phase starting position of the kick. So in order to solve that issue, we're just going to add a point right here, right after our last point, and we're just going to move it gradually like so until the kick and bass are aligned perfectly in phase. So essentially, we're changing the phase of the kick without ruining its transient and its starting position, and also without ruining the phase of the bass. And as you can see, if I take this point off, if I go here and play this kick and bass, you can see how they're clashing. And you can see it even clearly if I enable this. We're just cutting everything above C2. So we're going from this into this by using this point right here. So this is how it's going to look. As you can see, there's no phasing issues. There's no cancellation of the waveform. The kick and the bass are perfectly aligned in phase. So yeah, that's just a little trick right there. Okay, so now we're gonna work on the main melodic element, and in this track it's these 3 layers right here, and I'm gonna start with the main one, which is this. And what I'm gonna do right now actually is test you guys, since the whole point of these videos is for you to gain a better understanding on how to do it yourself, so you can actually implement all of this in your own tracks with your own sounds. So this is how the test is gonna work. I'm gonna play 3 versions of this sound, and you're gonna have to tell which one is the most balanced one in comparison to the kick and bass. And when I say balanced, I'm talking about spectrally balanced, so not too many highs, not too many lows. So which version is the most balanced in comparison to our kick and bass? Because as I said in the previous video, that's how we establish balance and uniformity across the mix. So our kick and bass are dictating the balance for the rest of the mix, since they're already well balanced and they work perfectly together. So I'm going to play now all the 3 versions back to back so you can identify which one is the most balanced one. Okay, so if you guessed the second version, then congratulations, you're correct. So here's what we had going on. The first version had a 12 dB boost. Then the third version had no boost at all, so it was the original sound. And the second version had a 6 dB boost. So I hope now you can actually see how easy it is to actually identify whether a sound is balanced or not based on the kick and bass, because they provide the context that you need in order to evaluate any given sound. Because as I said in the previous video, it's not about making any given sound good on its own. It's about making it sound balanced within the mix, so all of the sounds are working together and fulfilling their roles within the mix. And by the way, if you didn't get it right and it's a little bit tricky for you, I have a tip for you. So what you can do in order to help your ears focused a little bit better is to go here to Pro and B. So let's say you're trying to figure out if your sound has too many highs or too many frequencies in this area. What you can do is just solo the band and then listen to the specific sound you're trying to balance with the kick and bass, like so. And by the way, it doesn't have to be perfect, so don't stress about it. Like if you set it to 5 dB, 4 dB, 7 dB, 8 dB, like it doesn't really matter. As long as you get it in the same ballpark. I would say for this sound, around 6 dB sounds good. It's not too bright and not too dark. And as for the rest of the frequencies, everything is well balanced. There was no issues. Now, if I had access to the original sound within the synthesizer, I would actually not boost the highs like this. What I would do instead is open the cutoff a little bit more, letting the higher frequencies ring out a little bit more. Or even better, what I would do is automate the cutoff of the sound to open gradually as the sound plays throughout the drop, creating a little bit more movement in the sound. So just to keep in mind, like you don't always have to reach out for an EQ. Sometimes you can fix it within the sound itself by using the cutoff or whatever it is you're trying to fix. So yeah, that's the only thing that I did. I already leveled it as I showed in the previous video with my plugin over here. I just raised the volume until one of those bands showed 0, and then from there I adjusted it a little bit. So yeah, and then the other layers, I didn't do much as well. I just lowered both of them by 6 dB over here. As you can see, I applied the same EQ to both of them, and that's because we have 2 EQs over here on the master that are boosting the highs, so just to compensate for that. And then I repeated the same process, just went here until one of those bands showed 0, and then from there I leveled it, and this is how they all sound together. So I really didn't have to do a whole lot to these sounds. And before we move on to this layer, what I did was added a little bit of reverb. Here are the reverb settings that I have on. I have an OTT, there's 20%, a little bit. And this is a cool little trick. I usually add an autopan to the reverb just to give it a little bit of extra movement and make it a little bit more interesting in the stereo field. So as you can see, the autopan is modulating the left and right. So yeah, I just added a little bit of reverb because the original layers, they already have some reverb on them, but I didn't want to boost the side information of those layers because it would also boost the stereo information on the synths themselves, so all of the detuned voices. So I just added a little bit of reverb. You tell me if that sounds better or not. And of course, I also have a little bit of sidechain over here on the group of the layers. And now I want to talk about this layer right here. First, I'm going to play it to you. So here's how it sounds. So I actually don't like this layer. I think it takes away from the other 3. And as you can hear, it's way too bright. So I did the usual move to lower it by 6 dB, but also added this high cut, cutting everything above 5K hertz, because I don't want this layer to take any focus away from the other 3, and also to clear out some space for the drums that we're going to add later. And honestly, you know, I have to work with what I'm getting here within the rules of the format. You know what I mean? But if this this was my track, I would probably delete this layer altogether because I really don't think it's necessary for this track. I don't think it adds anything, and not only that, it also takes away from what we have. So, you know, this is something that every producer have to do, and my approach to this is when you're at the first stage, at the writing stage, at the beginning, you should add whatever comes to mind. So add as many stuff as you can, and then when you switch to the mixing stage, this is where you need to start cleaning stuff up and seeing what is actually necessary for the track and what is something that is hurting the track. And you have to be honest with yourself, you know, it's not an easy thing to do because we don't like killing our darlings, but you have to do it in order to make the best track you can, you know, and not hurt the integrity of the track. And sometimes, you know, if I feel like deep down I know that I need to delete a certain layer because it doesn't work within the context of my current track that I'm working on, but I don't want to delete it completely, what I will do is just copy it to a new project. So I always have it there. So that's a cool little tip right there that you can use. But yeah, you have to be honest with yourself. And of course, you know, this is my personal taste, and within the context of this specific track, you know, my opinion doesn't matter. So if he thinks that this layer adds something to the track, then that's the only thing that matters. You can do whatever you want to do, you know, whatever sounds good to you, that's your music. You have the right to do that, and there's no right or wrong necessarily when it comes to that. So yeah, but with that being said, I EQ'd and balanced it like so it doesn't interfere too much with the other layers that we have going on. And I also leveled it within the mix a bit lower relatively to the other layers. So this is how it sounds now within the context of the mix. So yeah, that's it for the leads. Okay, so now we're gonna work on the drums, and I'm gonna first tackle this hi-hat that we have over here, and currently it sounds like this. And usually when it comes to hi-hats like this, there's nothing for you to do, there's nothing for you to balance, because most of its frequencies reside within the 7K hertz and above, so they only fall under this band right here. So as you can see, this area right here, now it doesn't mean that it doesn't have frequencies over here, it just means that they're not as important as these frequencies right here. So as long as you don't have anything crazy like this on your hi-hats, then chances are that you don't need to do anything to your hi-hat. So that's why it's really easy to work with hi-hats. All you need to do is just level them within the mix. So now we're done with the hi-hat. Let's move on to the crash. As you can see, I applied the same EQ, just lowering it by 6 dB, and that's just to compensate for the 2 EQs that we have on the master, because I felt like it was a bit too bright. This is how it sounds without the EQ. And this is with the EQ. And a cymbal is a bit different than a hi-hat because it has way more character over here in this frequency range right here. So it's usually a sound that actually needs balancing, but in this case, there's nothing wrong with it. It already sounds good the way it is. So that's why I don't need to do anything else to it. What I am gonna do is, I'm gonna add this sidechain to it, just so it doesn't clash with our kick. Yeah, I think that's fine. And now we're gonna move on to these 2 clap layers, or rather snare and clap. So the snare that we have here sounds like this. And I thought it was a bit too bright, so I added the usual -6 dB EQ, and now it sounds like this. So yeah, I think it sounds good now, but the only thing that I don't like about this is the reverb tail that it has. So I think what I'm gonna do is just delete this like so. As we can see, a good thing that he did was to shift the snare a little bit to the side, so it doesn't start on the 1, it starts a little bit later, and that's because in order to avoid it messing and clashing with the transient of the kick. So that's actually a good thing that he did. So bravo to you for paying attention to this little detail and doing that. So I think something like this, let's see how this sounds. Yeah, something like this. And the reason why I just didn't like the reverb tail that it had is because the snare itself is very short and punchy, and having that reverb tail afterwards just didn't make quite sense to me. And, you know, once again, this is just my personal taste, so it's not a right or wrong thing. And I'm just gonna duplicate it like so. And also, you know, by doing this, by removing the reverb tail, we're actually making space for the other reverbs and the other elements within the track. Yeah, this totally works now. And now we have this clap layer that, and as you can see, it's shifted a little bit earlier. So it creates that little bit of snap right before the kick hits. And that's a really cool, nice little touch right there. And something that you can easily implement within your own tracks. So this is how the clap sounds. And once again, I applied the same EQ. I thought it was a bit too bright. And I already leveled it within the mix. And this is how it sounds with everything together. So yeah, it's really about repeating the same process over and over with each sound. Let me know if that's okay if I'm skipping stuff, you know, and not showing you the same thing over and over, because I feel like it's a little bit redundant to do. But let me know if you want to see it, you know, like... Whatever you want me to do, that's what I'll do. And next we have this percussion sound, which sounds like this. So you can hear how it's too bright, so I added the same EQ, and what I also did was I tried to boost the fundamental of the percussion sound, because as you can hear, it has a distinct pitch. But what I realized when I was trying to do so, that this percussion is actually tuned to G sharp, and our track is in F sharp. Now, it's not necessarily a problem, because G sharp, you know, depending on what scale you use, G sharp can be within the F sharp scale. But I thought it would be better to actually lower it down by 2 semitones to F sharp, so it plays the key of the track. And I also boosted the fundamental right here, so if I play this, you can see how it has this boost right here, this fundamental. And even if I disable the boost that I gave it, you can see how you can clearly identify it. I just wanted to boost it a little bit, so we have all of these frequencies more or less on the same level. Because to me, the most important thing about this sound is this fundamental, this part right here of the sound, and a little bit of the attack, the highs. And another thing that I did is to remove some of those higher frequencies, because it has a little bit of noise on top of it, and it's something that it's actually not necessary for the sound. I just want the initial transient, the initial click of it, but I don't want the noise, the high frequencies that come afterwards. And they can also interfere with the high frequencies that we already have in the hi-hat. So the way I'm going to remove them is by automating this cutoff to go from 18k hertz down to 2.5k hertz, and I have it set like so with the curve. And this is how it sounds with and without all of the EQs. So you can hear how we're only keeping the initial transient and removing everything that comes afterwards. Yeah, so the last drum layer that we have is this one right here, and just a bunch of percussions. And I felt like there's nothing that was necessary to do to them in order to balance them. They already sounded good. So I'm just gonna level them. So you will see right here how these two bands are hitting 0 dB, but within the percussion loop, there's some one-shot hit that comes every so often, and it's a bit louder than the other percussion that plays throughout the entire loop, and it goes above the 0 dB mark. So in that case, you just have to ask yourself, what is the most important element within this loop? And I chose to go by the percussion that actually plays throughout the entire loop instead of that one hit that comes every once in a while. So this is how it looks like. So you can see how we have that one shot that shoots up to 2 dB above the 0 line. What you can also do is, if you think that this one shot right here, I believe, if you think that it's too loud, you can always do this and just lower this by 2 dB. So now I believe that it should be hitting 0 as the rest of the percussions in the loop. Yes, as you can see, now the entire loop is hitting the 0 dB mark, and you don't have a problem. And that's it, we're done with the drums. Okay, and now we have this Reese bass. And I'm noticing 3 problems with this Reese bass. One, it doesn't have a lot of overtones. And that's not inherently a problem, it depends on the mix, but in this track specifically, the break feels very empty because there's not a lot of elements that are playing in order to cover the frequency spectrum. So I would love for this bass to have more harmonics, more overtones over here in order to fill up the spectrum a little bit better. And the second problem, as you can see right here, it plays the fundamental. Now, this is also not necessarily a problem, but it's just a personal rule of mine where I don't want any element within the break to play the fundamental. The only element that's supposed to play the fundamental is the bass at the drop. So that way I'm creating separation between the drop and the break and giving our drop way more impact when it comes in. So as I said, this is not a general rule, it's just my personal rule. So if you want the fundamental to play in the break, that's cool, but I would at least advise you to maybe lower it a little bit. So that way you're still creating a separation between the break and the drop. And the third problem with this bass is, as you can hear, it's very static. It doesn't move at all. So what I did was to just create a new Reese bass from scratch. And what I did with this one is just to go here into the wavetable editor and just remove the fundamental completely. And as you can see right here, the second oscillator is playing an octave up. So it helps us fill in the spectrum a little bit better. And what I did to create movement was to add this LFO into the cutoff and have it modulated gradually to open up, to reveal more frequencies, to help us fill in the space a little bit better, but also in order to create movement. And this is how it sounds like. And in order to level it within the mix, usually when I level sounds that only play during the break is to drag them over to the drop. So that way I have a reference. I'm leveling them in comparison to the kick and bass. So that way I achieve a consistent volume placement throughout the entire track. So it just helps to achieve uniformity and cohesiveness throughout the track. So as you can hear, it's well leveled compared to the kick and bass. It's not too loud, not too quiet. It's exactly where it needs to be. And now we have this flute sound. And it's a really good sound. The only problem that I have with it is that it plays in a lower octave. Once again, this is not necessarily a problem, but within the context of this mix, I feel like it will be better if it was pitched up an octave in order to help us fill in the spectrum a little bit better. So that's exactly what I did over here. I just pitched it up by 1 octave. And now if we listen to it, it fills up this section of the spectrum, but the new problem that we have is that we get all of those harsh highs. So what I did was to just cut everything above 3K hertz. So we're removing all of those harsh frequencies. And what I also did was to add this dynamic EQ bell in order to help boost those overtones of the flute so that they are in the same level more or less with the fundamental of the sound. As you can see, they're much closer to the fundamental, and this is how it looked before without this EQ. But now, because we removed all of those higher frequencies, the sound sounds a bit too dark. So what I did was to add this overdrive just to restore some of those higher frequencies. But also what it helps us to achieve is to glue this whole sound together and to squish it a little bit. So it sounds a little bit more cohesive, a little bit more stable, and this is how it sounds. As you can hear, another side effect of the pitching up, since the sound had delay on it, when we pitched it up, it created this very metallic feedback, which sounds cool. So, so sometimes you arrive at those happy accidents. I feel like it gives this sound a nicer touch. And in order to help it fill up the spectrum even more, what I did was to add reverb to it. So I'm sending it to the same reverb return track over here that we use for the leads in the drop. But also I'm sending it to this delay return track in order to have this echoing delay throughout the break that helps us fill in the break a little bit more. And this is how it sounds with our Reese bass. So even though the decision to pitch it up by 1 octave is not really a mixing decision, it's more of a production decision, I feel like it works in this context, but let me know what you think in the comments. And just to even fill up the spectrum even more, I created this reverse reverb effect in order to lead into the next shot. Now, it doesn't happen on every flute shot, but as you can see, it just helps us to make the break a bit more interesting. And I achieved it by throwing the reverb on the flute sound with a really long decay, and then I bounced it into audio, and I went inside and hit the reverse button. So as you can see, it reverses the sound, and it sounds like this. And then we have these 2 layers over here, this marimba sound. And I didn't have to do almost anything to it. The only thing that I did was to just cut out this frequency right here. As you can see, it has this bass note over here at F#2, so I just removed it because I felt like it wasn't necessary for the sound to have, but also in order to not clash with other sounds that we have going on in the break. And I applied this EQ to the group of these 2 layers in order to affect this sound as well that is playing in the drop. So as you can see, we're also removing a little bit from this sound, but I'm making one extra move with this sound. I'm lowering some of those harmonics that this sound has, because I felt like they were a bit too loud, and that's it pretty much. I also have this sidechain over here on the group of these 2 layers. And as you can see right here, I added this new layer, and what it is just a basic string sound, and it plays this high note in order to create tension, but also to fill up the spectrum a little bit better. So this is how it all sounds now. And before we move on to the sound effects and remaining layers, I want to talk about the vocal, and this is how it sounds. Hey ho, hey ho. Now the vocal is the main melodic element within the break, and unfortunately there's not much that I can do with it, because as I said in the previous video, if the vocal and instrument recording is not good, there's not much you can do afterwards in order to fix it. So the only thing that I did was to just lower the highs and also remove some of the lower frequencies over here. So it's really important to get the best recording you can, because then you don't have to deal with any problems later. So the problems with this vocal is that the performance could have been better, but also the quality of the recording could have been better. But I have a solution, because I feel like when it comes to these types of vocals, you don't necessarily have to have the best recording ever. What you can do is salvage it by applying some creative effects in order to mask those imperfections. So what I did was to add a vocoder. Now what the vocoder is going to do is make it sound like a vocoded vocal, in a lack of a better term. And what it also going to do is solve the performance issue in terms of pitch and staying in tune, because we can feed it whatever notes we want it to sing. So this is how it sounds now with the vocoder. So you can clearly hear how we're totally masking the original recording, and in order to get the best resolution out of the vocoder, I set the bands over here to 40 to the maximum. And let me show you what we're triggering the vocoder with. I have Serum 2 over here, and it's just 2 saw waves. The first one is an octave lower. It's a super saw with 10 voices and a little bit of detunement, and this works as a double-edged sword. So on one hand, the detuned voices are helping us get a little bit more air into the sound, a little bit more higher frequencies. So the vocoded vocal sounds more like a vocal, and it enables it to pronounce syllables better. So all of those types of sounds. But also, since we have detuned voices like this, it creates stereo information, which is going to phase out and be less predictable. So it's a give and take. And this is how it sounds with just this oscillator. And compare this to one voice. so you can clearly hear what I'm talking about. And I also added another oscillator 1 octave up, and I feel like it just makes it sound better. And of course you can experiment with different wavetables, different octaves, different voices and detunements. So yeah, then the next thing that I did in order to bring back some of those higher frequencies that the vocoder took from us is to duplicate the channel and have one without the vocoder. So this is just the raw vocals as they are. But as you can hear and see, I'm filtering all of the low frequencies and keeping only the high frequencies. So I'm layering it with the vocoded vocal, and this is how they sound together. So you can clearly hear how we're adding back that presence into the vocoded vocal. And I also did a bunch of other stuff in order to make it sound more stable. For starters, I have this multiband compressor and I'm splitting it at the 600 Hertz mark. That's just to compress the original vocal a bit more, so we have a more stable version going into the vocoder. And then after the vocoder, I have a compressor over here, just a regular compressor that is compressing all of this. And then I have OTT with these settings at 25%, taking a little bit of the highs just to glue everything together a little bit more. And then I have a saturator over here, as you can see the settings, just to make it even more stable. And then afterwards, I'm removing all of those unnecessary lower frequencies that were added with all of these effects. So just to make sure that everything stays clean. And I'm also sending this vocal into the reverb over here. So this is how it all sounds like. And this is with the context of the mix. And of course you can add way more effects like flanger and phaser and whatnot and do a bunch of more crazy stuff to it. So just for the sake of the rules of this format, I'm stopping here because I think we achieved the goal and I think it fits the track better now, but you let me know in the comments. And real quick, let's talk about the rest of the sound effects that we have going on over here. There's really not a whole lot for me to talk about that we haven't covered before. This is just me repeating the same cycle that I've already showed you. But something that I do want to talk about, for some reason, with a bunch of the layers within this track, I don't know if that was intentional or not, or maybe it's a side effect of the exporting process. But for some reason, a lot of the layers have this weird crispy highs, and not in a good way. They sound very dirty. So if I bypass all of this, listen to this sound. And you might say, oh, yeah, that's how the sound's supposed to sound like. And that's fine, you know, like if it's artistic preference, then that's cool. But I also hear it in a bunch of other layers like this one. Can you hear how grizzled it sounds? Like there's this sizzle on the high frequencies, and I actually don't know what to do about that. Like I don't know how you can fix something like this. Just for the sake of comparison, I have a regular white noise over here, so you can hear the difference. So you hear how the higher frequencies here are way smoother. I guess the way to avoid it is to just pay attention to stuff like distortion. And when I say distortion, not just plug-in distortion like distortion effects, but also distortion within the DAW, like gain staging and seeing that the channels are not clipping into the red. So yeah, there's nothing else that I wanted to say that is worth noting. I guess one last little thing that I can say about when layering sound effects and Foley and stuff like that is the same advice that I gave earlier, not to go overboard, because realistically, how many riser sounds do you need, or how many down sweeps do you need? You probably don't need more than 2 or 3. In some cases, 1 is even enough. So that's one thing. And the other thing, which I made an entire video on, is to not fall in love with Foley and let it tell the story. The story should always come from the musical elements themselves, from the actual musical content. And this is a mistake that I've made for years. Like I would throw all of these Foley sound effects into the track, and it sounded like a movie trailer that I'm the only one who knows what the movie is actually about. So you should always let the music tell the story, and the Foley elements are just there to support it. And this is especially relevant to this type of genre. Usually in Psy Trance, it's more about the atmosphere, so it's really easy to overdo it. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Okay, so we're finally at the mastering stage, and you can see the waveform of our mix and how balanced it looks. There's a uniformity in the drop and in the break. Nothing is sticking out, or there's no massive peaks and dips in the waveform. And I don't think there's a reason to go in each plugin settings, because the settings are exactly the same as the previous video. I didn't change anything. The only thing that I changed was over here in the limiter. I boosted this from 4 into 5, and that's just the input gain level. And I did that because I wanted to push the track even louder. And usually I would do that in the threshold, but as you can see, it's all the way down. Now, this is something you're probably not going to do in your own projects, but the reason why I have the threshold all the way down and I'm using the input gain instead is because the way I'm mixing stuff results in a very quiet mix. So therefore I have to use the input gain in order to boost it. But if you're not doing things exactly the way I do, then it's probably not going to be an issue for you guys. And another thing that I did, since we have a break over here, is something that I do in every track of mine, is to automate the threshold. So usually I start with the drop and I set the threshold to the drop. And then once I reach a final value in the threshold, I automate it to go down by 1 dB in the break. So in this case, in the drop, the value is set to -20. And in the break, as you can see, it's set to -19. That way we're increasing the separation between the drop and the break, and we're making our drop hit harder, but we're also getting a less limited break, which helps to increase the dynamics in the break, which are very important. And of course, it's a very subtle move and you can experiment with whatever sounds good to you. But once again, don't go overboard because it can be very noticeable. So yeah, that's all I did in the mastering here. And you can see how easy it is when you have a system. It doesn't matter what genre you're working on, what track do you have, it all fits in this one system and helps you get consistent results each time. So not only are you getting high quality, consistent results, but also you're wasting less time each time you need to master a track. You have the workflow already laid out. And that's really the key. This is what this whole thing is all about, is getting consistent result each time without guessing, something that works for every track. And of course, with every track you have freedom to change different parameters, make it brighter or darker, louder or quieter. You have total control over each track, but the overall workflow is the same. So I'm not guessing, should I put a compressor on it? Should I put an EQ, a distortion, a clipper? What settings do I need to use? I don't need to guess any of that. And that's really the beauty of it. And now there's something that I wanted to address, because ever since the first video in this series, I've been getting comments about people saying that they didn't like my version and that they liked the original version better, which is totally fine. I don't have a problem with that, since obviously when I'm working on these tracks, I'm inputting my personal taste and personal preferences. So I'm totally aware that it's not going to resonate with each person on the planet, and I'm totally fine with that. That's not the issue. The issue that I have is when people use that in order to say that since they didn't like my version, then it means that my version is bad and that it doesn't achieve the objective standards of a professional track. And that's totally not true, because you can't say that I'm not achieving objective standards. For example, you cannot say that we didn't achieve the -5 LUFS target, because we totally did without any distortion. So whether you thought that the track was too loud, like, that doesn't matter, because obviously you can turn it down. But the important part is me showing you how to achieve that. So that's why I keep reminding myself at each point to remind you guys that you have the freedom to do whatever you want. You don't have to follow me exactly and copy the same settings exactly and do exactly as I do. So if you don't like the tone of the kick that I'm making, that's totally fine. You can change it in the pitch curve. Just move the point slightly, you know, higher, lower, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, because you have the freedom along the way towards achieving those standards, and even after achieving those standards, to input your artistic vision and your personal taste and preferences. So the two don't contradict. You can achieve those objective standards while also making it sound how you want it to sound. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that, because that's what this whole series is about. And with that being said, let's do a little comparison between our master and the original one. So this is the spectrum of the new version, and this is the spectrum of the original mix. And as you can see, they're pretty similar. The changes that I'm noticing is that the original one is much brighter, as you can see here, but there's a massive cut of high frequencies over here. As you can see, this whole part is shaven off, while in our version, we still have frequencies over here. And another thing that I'm noticing is that in the original version, you can clearly see how the softer kick looks like and how our slightly punchier kick looks like. So our new kick peaks around here, as you can see, around the 60, 70 hertz. And in the original one, it's around 50 hertz. But yeah, other than that, they look pretty similar, I'm not gonna lie. And if we compare loudness, we can see that we're hitting around -6 LUFS, which is totally fine. But if you wanna make it louder, then you're probably gonna have have to either sacrifice some more low end, meaning going over here into Pro MB and lowering this to -3 or -4 even, which will allow you to push it even further in the limiter over here. Or another way to do that is to boost the highs even more. So going over here and boosting this to +6 or +7. And that will tilt the whole balance and will make the track louder. And we can see that the original version is also hitting around -6 LUFS. So overall, pretty similar versions, but with minor differences. So yeah, I think now is time to actually hear them and compare the two. And you let me know which one you like better. And now here's the final result. Yeah, so I'm happy with the final result, but you know that my opinion doesn't matter here. So let's see what Lucid Bloom had to say about it. So as you can see, he loved it and only mentioned the pumping of the leads, which is fair and easily fixable by either lowering their volume or easing up on their sidechain. So what do you guys say? Did we fix this mix? Let me know what you think in the comments below. It was really fun working on this track, so thank you to Lucid Bloom for sending it. And if you want to submit yours, then check the description to learn how to do so. And yeah, I also want to thank everyone who made it this far into the video and for getting the channel to over 2,000 subscribers. I appreciate you all and it really means a lot to me. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.